Have you ever felt tired before the day even began? Not physically tired, not the kind sleep fixes. I mean that strange, invisible exhaustion, the kind that comes from having to be someone all the time. Someone agreeable, someone successful, someone attractive, someone composed, someone who knows exactly what they want, exactly what they're doing, exactly how they're supposed to be seen. Imagine the weight of carrying expectations you never consciously chose, the pressure to maintain appearances you didn't design, the constant effort of performing desires that may not even be yours. And maybe the strangest part is, your life can look completely normal. You wake up, you answer messages, you go to work, you laugh at the right moments, you say the right things, you play your role so well that even the people closest to you may never suspect anything is wrong. But underneath it, there's a quiet feeling. Something is off. You feel it in the morning before the noise begins. You feel it in conversations that somehow leave you emptier than before. You feel it when people praise you for the version of you that feels least real. And sometimes, in the middle of a crowded room, it hits you with terrifying clarity. Why does my life feel so performed? Why do my interactions feel so polished and yet so empty? Why do I feel unseen even when everyone is looking at me? That is not laziness. That is not simple burnout. That is not just overthinking. Sometimes that exhaustion is the cost of living too far away from yourself. The origin of the mask. The tragedy usually begins early. Long before we had the language to describe ourselves, we were already being taught what makes a person worthy. We learn, sometimes subtly and sometimes brutally, that love becomes warmer when we perform well, that approval comes faster when we are pleasing, that admiration comes easier when we are impressive, that being productive, attractive, accomplished, obedient, and socially desirable is not just rewarded, it is quietly mistaken for being valuable. So a mask begins to form. The British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called this the false self. In healthy amounts, it can be a social adaptation, a polite, functional way of moving through the world. But Winnicott warned that when this adaptive self becomes too dominant, it stops protecting the inner self and begins to cover over it, draining spontaneity and aliveness. That is how the false self is born. Not because you were weak, not because you were fake, but because at some point your system learned a painful lesson. Being authentic is risky. Being impressive is safe. If your sadness was inconvenient, you learned to smile. If your anger threatened connection, you learned to suppress it. If your real interests were mocked, you learned to edit them. If love felt conditional, you learned to become whatever kept love from disappearing. And that adaptation may have helped you survive. But what protects the child can slowly imprison the adult. The adult consequences. Years later, many people are still wearing the same mask, only now it is so familiar that they no longer know where it ends and where they begin. This is the real danger of the false self. It doesn't always feel dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself as a crisis. Often, it appears as a vague but persistent disconnection. You become highly functional, but internally absent. You know how to perform competence, but not how to feel alive. You know how to manage your image, but not how to answer the question, who am I when nobody needs anything from me? And this disconnection rarely looks like poetic sadness. It more often shows up in ways that are far less romantic and far more common. It looks like irritability, defensiveness, emotional numbness, chronic sarcasm, coldness in intimacy, a subtle contempt for vulnerability, especially your own. Because when authenticity has been coded as dangerous, the nervous system does not relax into honesty, it armors. And when softness feels unsafe, hardness starts to feel like strength. When vulnerability feels humiliating, distance starts to feel intelligent. When real feeling feels exposed, performance becomes control.
This is why some people become difficult, not because they are evil, but because they are estranged from themselves. When authenticity feels unsafe, toxicity often becomes a substitute. Not always loud toxicity. Sometimes it is quieter than that. It is the inability to apologize without feeling weak, the inability to listen without preparing a defense, the inability to be present without curating an impression, the inability to love without managing how love reflects on the ego. The false self doesn't just hide pain, it can turn pain into posture. And the longer that posture is maintained, the harder it becomes to remember that it is a posture at all. The prison of the persona. This is where Carl Jung becomes essential. Jung used the word persona to describe the mask we wear in order to function in society, the socially adapted face we present to the world. He saw it as necessary. We all need some version of it. We all play roles. We all adjust to context. No one moves through life in a state of total naked authenticity. But Jung's warning was clear. The mask becomes dangerous when we identify with it completely. The persona is useful as a bridge between the individual and society, but when it becomes rigid, when we confuse how we appear with who we are, it can contribute to neurosis and sever us from the deeper life of the psyche. That is the prison. What once protected you begins to imprison you. What once helped you adapt begins to suffocate what is most alive inside you. The mask hardens into armor, and then the armor fuses to the skin. At that point, a person may be admired by everyone and known by no one. They may have status, influence, beauty, achievement, yet feel inwardly vacant. Because the more fully they become the persona, the less access they have to their inner life. And without access to your inner life, empathy begins to weaken too. Because if you cannot feel yourself honestly, you will struggle to feel others honestly. If your own pain must be managed, hidden, or transformed into performance, then the pain of others becomes inconvenient as well. You stop relating, you start positioning. This is why over-identification with the persona doesn't just distort identity, it corrodes intimacy. It narrows compassion. It turns life into theater. And no matter how convincing the performance becomes, the psyche keeps sending signals. Emptiness, restlessness, resentment, a strange grief with no obvious object. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something true in you has been unattended for too long. The antidote. So what breaks the spell? Not more self-improvement, not a better image, not a more sophisticated performance. The beginning is much quieter than that. The antidote to the false self is silence. Because silence is where performance begins to fail. In silence, there is no audience to manage, no applause to chase, no role to hide inside, no distraction strong enough to keep you permanently occupied. And that is exactly why so many people avoid it. Silence forces a confrontation. It reveals the pain the mind has been avoiding. It exposes the emptiness beneath the overactivity. It shows you how much of your identity has been borrowed from expectation, imitation, fear, and reward. Silence is uncomfortable because it removes your camouflage. But it is also merciful. Because what feels unbearable at first is often the first honest meeting with yourself. And here is the warning. A person who never meets themselves in silence is living a borrowed life. A life shaped by voices they did not choose, by standards they did not examine, by desires they inherited, by performances that won approval while quietly costing them their soul. So simplify. Strip things back. Spend time without the noise, without the scroll, without the persona-enhancing rituals that keep you from hearing your own interior. Let there be moments with no excess to hide behind, no polished answers, no aesthetic of wisdom, no performative healing, just honesty. Ask yourself, what do I actually feel when no one is watching? What am I pursuing that I never truly chose? What part of me have I abandoned to remain acceptable? And what would it mean to stop being impressive long enough to become real? Because the goal is not to destroy every mask. Some masks are necessary. The goal is to remember that it is a mask, to wear it when needed, to remove it when truth is required, to stop confusing survival strategies with identity, to stop calling adaptation a self. Your real life begins the moment the performance is no longer the center of it. And maybe that's the real invitation here. Not to become someone new, but to stop abandoning the one who was there before the world told you who to be. If this resonated with you, then maybe the question is no longer, how do I become more acceptable? Maybe the question is, who am I without the mask? And are you finally ready to meet them?